Bonjour à tous, bienvenue.
So good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm waiting for everyone to settle in, those of you in the audience. So you're slowly but surely taking place in this virtual meeting room. So thank you for coming here onto this focus session concerning access to climate data for non-state actors from African countries. My name is Antoine Gillot. I'm the coordinator of the Climate Chance Observatory, CCO. So first little house cleaning tip. You have interpretation in French and in English. So if you want to follow the discussion either in French or in English, you can hit the icon at the bottom of your screen and then select your language that you'd like to listen to.
So if you want to follow the discussion either in French or English, you can just click on the globe at the bottom of your screen and select your preferred language. Thank you. Pour ma part, je vais donc m'exprimer en...
So I'm going to speak in French for the entirety of this workshop. I hope I'll be able to express myself in a clear manner. So let's think about today's context. So concerning Climate Chance, which was founded in 2015, which was put together to increase reflection about various climate topics concerning with NGOs and civil society and other stakeholders. For that, we have three main missions: share information with action mapping. We have a library also on our site, and we also have a climate agenda. So we also have to analyze our actions. This is what I coordinate with Tanya, Marine, and Samuel. We see what state players are really driving climate action in their countries, and also what organizations are doing. And the third mission is to bring together the players through our climate coalition that we've seen during this two-day summit, in this Climate Chance Africa Summit. And we've seen this in the various workshops that are dedicated to the topics. We also look at new issues concerning transversal topics in all of the sectors concerning greenhouse gas emissions and other issues. And this is why we're going to look at today the question of access to climate data. It's an issue that's been flagged quite often since yesterday in all of the discussions, not only concerning water management, but also in mobility management, in city urban areas, and also energy access. So there's not one singular discussion that has not brought up also the question of climate data access. So for today, we have an expert panel from various horizons, from research and development, NGOs, and also from those who are working on the ground, and those who have put together their own companies. So I'm not going to really go into all of the details, but I'd like to remind that the Paris Agreement was really focused on transparency, on its Article 13. So the access to data is very essential to be able to follow and to write about and to describe follow-up in the states, and also that are undertaken by the states and the various actors. This gives also a certain amount of flexibility to this obligation to be transparent. It's something that's very new, and there's a lot of know-how, methodological and technical know-how that is necessary. And there's also, it is underpinned by a culture of analyzing and collecting data. So that's why today we're going to look at this topic with our panelists who are in Africa, and to see what they're doing in their own initiatives and undertaking. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Dr. Ayumpe, who is a postdoctoral postdoctorate in Irvine University of California. He's also an invited researcher at the International Institute for Tropical Agriculture in Cameroon. Recently, he just published an academic article called Trends and Drivers in African Fossil Fuel and CO2 Emissions from 1990 to 2017. So this was an article to see what is really the movement of these greenhouse gas emissions in Africa being emitted by using fossil fuels. So let's look at what is the dynamic situation concerning greenhouse gases in Africa over the last 30 years.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to present some of the work that we've done on CO2 emissions in Africa. So today, my name is Dr. Modi Lako, and as you rightly introduced, I'm in the University of California in the Department of Earth System Science. And the work I'll be presenting today is titled Evolution of Fossil Fuel Greenhouse Gas Emissions from 1990 to 2017 in Africa. So, I'm going to present background and then go ahead to present the methodology that we used and the data sources, and then some of the results that we got, and then some conclusions. So just some background, there are international efforts to avoid dangerous climate change, and these aim for global CO2 emissions to be net zero by 2050. This goal actually requires a drastic reduction in emissions from high-income countries, but also you also have to reduce emissions in low countries that are still developing, especially those that have large increases in emissions. Till date, most of the analyses are focused on rich countries where they have emission reduction programs, and very little attention has been paid to low-income countries, and most of these low-income countries are in Africa. It's worth noting that energy-related CO2 emissions are the primary cause of anthropogenic climate change. The sources of primary energy consumed actually affect the per capita CO2 emissions. So having that as background, we decided to use a Kaya framework to analyze and decompose trends in and drivers of African CO2 emissions from the combustion of fossil fuels between 1990 and 2017. So the Kaya framework is made up of the population. You have also the per capita GDP, you have the energy intensity, and then you also have the emissions intensity. So if you want to do that on a continent-wide basis, you need the population of the continent as well as GDP per capita for the continent. And you can still use this formula to decompose and also analyze the trends in a country. So for the data sources, we obtain them from the International Energy Agency as well as the World Bank. As you rightly said at the beginning, that Africa is plagued by lack of data. So out of the 54 countries in Africa, we're able to get data only from 27 countries. That was enough to carry out the analysis. So there is still a lot of work to be done. And some other analyses cannot even be carried out in some of these countries because the data that's available is not disaggregated enough to enable such analysis. Out of these 27 countries where we got data, 41 of them, they represent 41% of the African population. as well as 72% of the GDP in 2017. In terms of energy supply, we looked at the total primary energy supply within the continent of Africa, and between 1990 and 2017, we can see from the figure that it's being dominated by biofuels as well as waste. And there's been an increase in the quantity of total primary energy that's used. And between 1990 and 2017, it increased by 86%. In terms of the shares of the different fuels, the share of oil actually increased most from 11% to 24%, while that of natural gas increased from 8% to 15%. So it shows that there is an increased use of oil as well as natural gas at the detriment of biofuels and waste. So in terms of CO2 emissions, there has been an increasing trend in Africa's CO2 emissions, as we can see on the figure on the right. So South Africa, Egypt, Algeria, and Nigeria, those four countries actually contribute a lot to the emissions. In 2017, Africa's total emissions was 1,185 million tons of CO2 equivalent, and that represented just about 4% of global emissions. So Africa still contributes really very low in terms of total CO2 emissions. But then some other indicators that show that Africa, for example, in terms of the emissions per capita, it actually has low emissions per capita as well as a low CO2 intensity. We use the Kaya identity to decompose the emissions, as I earlier said, in Africa. So in the figure A is about Africa. So we see the change in total emissions from 1990 to 2017. So it increased by 120%. That was largely influenced by increase in population, as well as the emissions intensity and growth in GDP. So the energy intensity actually dropped. So that also helped to keep emissions a bit controlled. In terms of absolute change in emissions between 1990 and 2017, Mozambique had the highest change in emissions, followed by Benin, and then you have Senegal, Ethiopia, and Tanzania. So here we see how the different factors, Kaya factors, actually influence the growth or changes in emissions. In the next chart, I have trends in the Kaya factors of the highest emitters in Africa. So here we are seeing that the highest emitters do not necessarily have the highest change in emissions between 1990 and 2017. So here we also see how, say, for South Africa, you had an increase of 73% in emissions, and that was largely driven by increase in population, changes in the energy intensity, as well as GDP per capita. And we can also see that for almost all the large emitters, we had an increase in CO2 emissions. We went back and looked at patterns in historic CO2 emissions and tried to plot them for different countries. And here we see that in both 1990 and 2017, South Africa still remained the highest emitter in the continent. So in 1990, they had 243 million tons of carbon equivalent, while in 2017, that increased to about 422 million tons of CO2 equivalent. And then Egypt, Algeria, and Nigeria were the next highest emitters in both 1990 and 2017. And here we see countries in gray where no data is available. We went ahead to calculate the annual average changes in emissions between 1990, that's the plot in C, as well as the average annual changes between 2010 and 2017. So this was aimed at giving us the trends between long-term emission changes between 1990 and 2017, as well as short-term recent changes between 2010 and 2017. So from the results, we saw that Mozambique actually has the highest annual average CO2 emissions in recent time of about 43%, followed by Zambia, about 29%, and then Botswana. And it's worth noting that all countries actually recorded a net increase in emissions except the DRC and Togo, where the emissions actually stayed the same between 2010 and 2017. And then Libya actually experienced a drop in emissions between 2010 and 2017. So these average values are actually important, especially for the short term, because we use them to make some projections to see what emissions would look like by 2030. So in terms of the patterns of CO2 emissions, we can use them to explain, they can be explained by many factors, including GDP. So here we plotted the emissions per capita in tons of CO2 per person against GDP per capita per person. So here we see that countries that have high GDP per capita also have high CO2 emissions. So you look at the case of South Africa and Libya, they have high emissions per capita that can be explained also by the high GDP per capita. So in conclusion, I would say that African CO2 emissions were just 4% of global fossil fuel emissions in 2017. And this has grown relative to 1990 by about 4.6% annually on average, compared to the global average of 2.2%. So we're seeing that Africa actually has a high rate of increase in CO2 emissions. And then in 2017, only the top 10 countries in Africa accounted for about 87% of the continent's emissions. So these are actually countries that policies to reduce emissions have to target. And then despite modest reductions in some countries, the projections of rapid population growth as well as GDP per capita would definitely drive increases in emission. So you have different policies like Agenda 2063, and then the population in most countries that has been increasing. And then you also have a lot of efforts to increase electricity generation in rural areas. So all of that would definitely lead to an increase in emissions in Africa if proper measures are not put in place. So indeed, if the continent-wide average growth rate of 2010 and 2017 persists, then by 2030, Africa's emissions would have risen by about 30%. So moving from 1,185 to about 1,545 million tons of CO2 equivalent. So thank you very much for listening, and that's it from my end. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Ayompe, pour votre présentation.
Thank you, Dr. Ayompe. I think thanks to your summary of this article, we have a very simple and very comprehensive overview of the situation. Since the 1990s, we can see a global growth of the emissions, and there are will continue to grow with the demographic expansion and the economic growth. We can also see the various patterns of this evolution with countries that are more or less quickly increasing. Our Senegal, who is our host for this summit, is one among the countries of which the economy is growing very quickly and is probably going to increase its greenhouse gas emissions. But these national situations, they present each time very different characteristics, and I think that's also the aim of what Jana from the Association Bilan Carbone, the Joaira Touvag. She is the energy project manager for the Association Bilan Carbone, and she's proposing to develop carbon strategies that will be adapted to local context. We can understand that from one country to the other, 1 liter of fossil oil does not have necessarily the same carbon intensity than in another country, and this is linked to the quality of the equipment, as Charlene Kwasi yesterday from the Observatory of African Mobilities recalled that in many countries, most of the car pools are second-hand and substandard cars imported from Europe, and this can contribute to reduce the energy efficacy of the equipment. For example, Ivory Coast has passed a legislation banning the import of substandard cars in order to better take into account and better calculate the greenhouse gas emissions at the local and national level. So, Joaira Yatou, can you explain this to us? Yes. Can you hear me? Dr. Ayampe, thank you. If you could turn off your microphone. Yes. Can you see my screen? Yes, we can see your screen. Okay. I'm going... So, Joaria Touwagé, I am the project manager methodology within the Association Bilan Carbone. As Antoine said, the aim of this presentation is to speak about the development of specifically carbon bases in specific countries or region. It can be at regional level, or the idea is to really highlight the arguments that valorize the creation of a carbon base at national level. So, sorry, ABC is Association Bilan Carbone. It's the Association for Carbon Auditing and how we can find solutions, how we're going to act. And there's two main pillars on the development of carbon bases. It's the governance issues. It's not necessarily the first challenge we're thinking about, but it's fundamental in order to ensure the development of a carbon basis, particularly its maintainment on a longer term, and especially the methodological aspects. What methodology is to be used, and as Dr. Ayampe has explained, we see that in the data levels, there's two levels that that can be used for carbon accounting, and also to conclude, and we'll come back on the different solutions that we have developed. So the Association Bilan Carbone, or ABC, was created in 2011 in order to develop the methodology of carbon auditing in order to favorize strategies of decarbonization. So the tools that are used to do this carbon auditing was developed by ADEME, which is the French Agency for Ecological Transition. In the beginning of the year 2000, we had the first development of the tool, and then 2011 the association was created so that the ADEME could focus more on regulatory support. So since 2011 we're developing essentially carbon strategy methodology, and we're providing it with to different institutional partners who want to calculate their carbon footprint. Of course, we need to coach, we need to audit the associations for the after audit period. So since 2015, we have created a management system for emissions that is kind of like the energy management systems that we find in the standard systems, that allows to implement an action plan once we have done the accounting, develop actions and follow the indicators, and be able to do a reporting on the indicators and facilitate also the second carbon accounting exercise. All this was done at the French level, but since 2016 we also have our aim is to develop our solutions at the international level. That's why in 2016 ABC and ADEME, they have worked on the assistant local partners in ecological transitions for already mature institutions that already have carbon accounting and can implement action plans. And so when we reach the stage, we say, what can we do first? Well, the next stage will be to evaluate the strategy to see it's compatible with the 2-degree maximum and the Paris Agreement goals. What else are we doing today beyond the organizations? I think, Joatou, you could maybe slow down a bit. Interpreters are thanking you. So based on all the solutions for the institutions, our aim is, of course, to distribute this disseminate with a wider audience. That's why we have developed awareness-raising initiatives in schools with business partners through meetings so that they can know about the carbon auditing of their institution. And also we publish leaflets and publications that informs the wider audience on carbon accounting and transition strategies, and also arguments in order to motivate organizations to do their carbon auditing. So why do we focus on the developing of databases, of carbon databases? The first thing is when you're doing carbon accounting is to try to find a tool, because it's the tool that is going to allow us to achieve our results or get our results. But of course, when you're looking for a tool, you're going to find different issues depending on what your status is, be you territory, a company, or a civil society movement. What allows you to do the carbon accounting? You have emission factors and the data that you can collect. So your emission factors, they're not common to the same. Some factors are common to everyone, but others are very specific and will allow you to highlight the local aspect of emission accounting based on the geographical context. That is why there's a need to have these emission factors for a specific country. The aim is, of course, to have a calculation tool and to have the proper data set so that you can calculate accurately your carbon footprint, be it an organization or a territory. So a quick overview to show you databases plus a calculation tool allows you to give you an idea of your carbon footprint and your emission footprint. So why did we start on this? First of all, we based ourselves, of course, on the experience of ADEME. In France, the ADEME is the one who managing the carbon database, which is a database on emission factors. They've been doing this for the past 20 years. They've developed this at the beginning of the year 2000 and it continue it. It's a multi-stakeholder governance model, and we have a database that is freely accessible and that combines public and private data, and it contains about 5,000 emission factors with 48,000 people who are members and over 22 contributors of data, knowing that ADEME, they're not the only ones who are monitoring the emission factors. There's organizations, there are federations of organizations that are working on this and that can develop their own criteria and offering it to integrate it in the database in order to serve a wider audience. Next to that, we've also led a European project called LIFE over 3 years. The aim was to advocate for public policies within greenhouse gas emissions for Greece, Hungary, Croatia, and Italy to create databases. They had no tools to evaluate the carbon footprint. So the idea was to set up a common tool for carbon auditing, and a database for each country that was then shared widely among the partners on the website. The idea was to really be an example or motivate other countries who want to start to do their own carbon auditing and carbon accountability. The idea was to base ourselves on existing data, do a benchmark on existing databases, the UNFCCC, carbon accounting, the British database, the US database, Australian database, Japanese database. We've taken pretty much all the emission factors that we had that were available in order to develop a common methodology that can be used to build a database for country that be interested. But of course, since we were limited in time, we focused more on the development of the database and without insisting on the governance aspect, which I mentioned earlier. So the challenge of governance is not necessarily the first thing you think about, but it's absolutely fundamental if you want to maintain the database. So the idea is to be able to define a structurating. Numerous actors are interested in participating, and so you need to have a structure, a framework that can basically ground and maintain this carbon database. So we choose the structure via a certain number of criteria. The first one is, of course, the legitimacy of bringing together the actors around the topic of the carbon accounting and carbon database. So an stakeholder wants to do its carbon accounting and carbon auditing, can find this stable and trustworthy information. Also, it needs to have the technical know-how in the elaboration and the setting up of such a specific database. It also needs to have the financial means to support such a project, because there is a cost associated, human resources, but also the supporting activities that will be implemented, being the web support, for instance, in order to have them online data accessible. And of course, we are not going to do a three-legged dog. We're going to try to create a governance committee, network of stakeholders and actors that can support the launch and the feeding of information into this database. And of course, we're going to hire different actors that can feed into the database, that can contribute resources. So we have 22 for the moment. So this structure will be able to carry out studies in order to evaluate the data, but also collect these resources from other partners that have developed their own emission factors and that they're willing to share them in order to feed into the database. So all these skills from these different actors is going to allow to make the carbon database more consistent, to ensure the development of the tool or parallel tools that can help to exploit this. It's kind of a hub of carbon auditing within the country or the region that is concerned. So here quickly as illustration, I don't know if you can read. On the last slide, I put the link towards the Mediathèque for the carbon auditing, where you can read the full report in French and where you find all the different graphs. So just to show you visually how it looks, that you need various skills, which we have to represent it with various colors. In green is what we call the scientific expertise. That will be brought by the hosting institution, but also specific scientists or scientific researchers that will be mandated by the steering committee. And it's also possible to have an international expertise via other organizations or structures that are working in the country, for instance, in order to contribute to disseminate tools and methodologies to develop the carbon database. Let's not forget, of course, the users, the individual users. It's important to have a representation of the users within the steering committee, so that we can have feedback on the needs, on the comments, on the criticism, and also facilitate their access to the carbon database based on the means that will be based on their needs and means. And of course, in everything linked to the technical, logistical aspects, the support, the training, dissemination of the project, the needs in terms of animations, community animator, or awareness raising, publishing documents or leaflets or reports in order to support these institutions in their implementation of carbon auditing. Another step is to bring everyone together, all the skills, and of course define what the different skills are that we need. This is only, you can only see at the beginning of here. This table is about 2 pages long. Here you see all the skills that are needed and the associated skills in order to be able to identify actors at the local level and to benefit from the advantages or the issues that you can feed into the steering committee in order to ensure that you really have all the skills needed to build a carbon auditing database. Here you see all the activities that you need in order to build a carbon database. It's not the emission factors, it's also the tools in order to be able to use the emission factors, because these emission factors will be included in tools in order to facilitate the use by the use. It's an animation of the community, which we mentioned, but also other multiple resources that will be able to support the users without forgetting the main mission, which is the development of transition strategies. This will, of course, come up that you need to anticipate upon creation of the data in order to carry a concrete object. So here you have all the actors, the steering committee, all the stakeholders, all the actors, financial actors, data suppliers, and the users.
So now let's look at the methodology. Why do we have this? Why do we have to put together this climate database? Sometimes there is data in previous articles, and then you can see how they were able to put together their carbon base. There are various methodology choices that you can adapt relevant to the context. You have to see what is the main data source. So, for example, the carbon base has more than 5,000 emissions factors. And there's also priority sectors that we have to look at. Dr. Lacour spoke about this. So this allows us to follow the various indicators over the long term in various countries and following their population growth. And it also allows us to forecast the greenhouse gas emissions. We can energy, transport, industry, all of these are the factors that will solidify the carbon base. So not only do we have to look in the literature and previous reports, but we also have to create new data, because we know that the publications are not complete concerning the data, the necessary data. So we look at life cycle analyses. These are put together by experts and scientists. And also we have to bring in these experts and scientists when you put together your own base. One of the things that we really have to look at is transparency. Antoine spoke about this. Transparency of the data, of course. It's a very important value addition when we put together our carbon base, because not all of the data is put together in the same way. So transparency is important. And for some of the data, there is a type of uncertainty concerning the validity of its findings, and then how we can transmit this to the final user to make sure that the quality is of the highest level. Of course, there is also initiations of the various users. when you look for the various factors, you need to have the base that you're going to calculate upon. And we also have to know how these factors were put together, with which parameters do they take into account, for example, production. This will allow us to give more information concerning how we actually put the data together, how the data was collected and then analyzed. And we also have to inform the user about this. There's also the verification process that has to be put in place. It's very important to make sure that the data is valid. And this will then be done by third parties. And we also have to have a homogeneous type of data given to the governance councils, which are then also developed by third parties. All of these processes are very important to put together and to feed the base, because when we know that the quality of the data is good, then we know that this data will be able to be used on a greater level, not only for the academics, but also for the population at large. So how do we publish it? We can do it either on the web version or on a tablet version. This is a choice that has to be made by the governance. All of this this decision has to be made following the local context. We have to know if, for example, those who want to use the data, if they have a very easy access to the internet. So these are questions that have to be taken into account.
Et puis on va partager après, de toute façon, toute la documentation dans le chat.
So following, you're going to share all of the documentation in the chat. So over and above putting the base together, we also have to look at the tools. So I looked at the carbon base and also the carbon review. All of these things are things that we have to look at. They're tools that we have. Some of them may be simple. It depends upon who your target and what your target is. As the users become more and more able to ingurgitate more complex data, then you're going to have to use maybe more complex and sophisticated tools. All of the information that I have spoken about is available in a framework paper that was put together this summer, available in English and in French on our website. This will allow you why put together a base, how, what are the challenges, how you really roll out the project, and also all of the development that is part and parcel of putting together a carbon base. So the questions of sectors, education, the tools used. All of this shows us how to be able to use what we have at hand, taking into account the relevant national and population factors. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. So access to this report is on ABC's website. You can see it here on the screen. You can also contact the Institut de Formation Carbone, which is a training institution. It has various training sessions for carbon review and also carbon bases. You can find more information about this in the chat. We had someone raise his hand during this presentation. We're going to try to give these people the opportunity to make comments or to ask their questions at the end of the various speeches here today. So thank you very much for having presented to us this your presentation concerning the carbon review and carbon bases. We will be able to look at the statistical point of view for the accounting, the methodology that's necessary. You also brought up the idea of uncertainty. It's a very important issue, especially when we have to keep in mind the notion of transparency concerning the greenhouse gas emissions. I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Thomas Lovo.
Tu travailles en tant que chercheur sur ces
You work as a researcher on these topics, and you look at the various gaps in the carbon review concerning accounting and also data validity. You also look at various carbon and atmospheric measures. And you can tell us why this is interesting for this topic, and how what you're working on allows is an a value addition to what we've spoken about up until now. So I've got a lot of slides here. I'm going to try to go quickly without speaking quickly. So I'd like to look at the tools that are available and that have already been rolled out in some cities. We've done it with partners. Some younger stakeholders were not able to present during the COVID crisis, but here we have three partners who worked on this. They worked on these projects a lot. So we look at the self-reported inventories. It's something that you need before having a climate policy. You need to have numbers that stick. If you don't have valid numbers, future forecasts will not be valid. There's a lot of time lag between compiling the data and actually producing the SRIs. It can go from anywhere to 2 to 5 years. We don't have a lot of up-to-date information, so that complicates the problem. And we also see that there are various inventories that have different protocols. There's also a lot of uncertainty as to calculating methods. The speaker before me spoke to us about the difficulty in having these proper emission factors. It's something that has been condensed since the 1980s, and also in some countries they absolutely do not take it into account. There has been progress, significant progress, following various summits, for example, the Covenants of Mayors and the C40. They're working on this issue to try to really create a standard way of doing things. But it's difficult to find an agreement between all of the cities and all of the local governments. So what we've done is something totally different. Here is an example coming from the United States, and it could be applied to various countries. We try to put together one national scale. And this is the only national real scale. There is no tracking following energy exchanges or natural resource exchanges. The only tracking that we have is the national scale, which is the most feasible. And we try to then increase the resolution. And to do that, we need to have a lot of information concerning traffic, consumption, gas, heating, etc., etc. So you need to have various maps. You can see they're very high resolution. And then we try to include that into the national scale. So these are the only numbers that we can base our work upon, and because they're very valid. So when we look, if each city does its own inventory, we see that there are large gaps. And when I say gaps, it can be an almost 100% gap. Each city put in its own protocol, following advice coming from their own experts. So each city puts together their own protocol. Some cities use the same protocols, others don't. So there is an enormous gap in the results. Why is this the case? Because this has been going on for a long time, especially concerning consortium and protocols. And it's been very complex, and there have been various protocols that have been put together. And there are other organizations that are trying to do link up between all of these protocols and organizations. And this has led to enormous gaps between the various cities. So how do we reconcile the inventory approaches? we need to put in place stricter guidelines, and we have to support the cities at the national level, because each country cannot have the same and the proper expertise and the same data. So we're here to help them and come together to create a dynamic inventory supported by atmospheric information. We take into account private companies, industrial. So we have to look at, for example, methane emissions. There's no measurement, precise, clear measurement for methane. So each person measuring methane does it in their own way. So that's why this atmospheric measurement is the most important. We don't quite simply use emissions and inventories. We base our data on daily measurements. And this allows us to see if emissions are going down. So you need a base inventory, then you put it in like in a database, like a weather database, and you see what should be seen. And then you compare this to what you actually observe in the measurement. And usually we see that we are underestimating, because we see that what we're actually collecting in data is lower. Or excuse me, what the model has given is lower than the actual measurements. So here we see a large city with urban sprawl, and we see a measurement network. And then we've done the tracking on a weekly basis of the emissions. You can see here with the various ups and downs, you can see the traffic. Your average American will use a car a lot. And we also see the difference between the residential areas and this will then have an impact in the high winter and high summer. Here you can see that if you use AC more at a certain time, then it will be used at a greater level. So we can see that the inventory, so our base, does not really link up with what we actually measure. So here is Minneapolis. It's a square, as you may wish. So here we have the county and the limits of the city. So we can see three scales within the same graph, but it's the same urban structure. And you can see that there is a large gap. Why? Because we underestimate traffic, fuel collection is not measured. We haven't differentiated the various components of the emissions. So there are a lot of gaps. So today, Indianapolis is using a model that is 40% less than what is actually being measured. And we can see that there is an 80% error rate as to what they've estimated and to what they're observing. So they're totally underestimating the actual emissions. So let's look at the Parisian example. COVID confinement has really changed for the short term the behavior of the city dwellers. So we've done it in real time, and we can see over the past 3 years. So 2018 to 2020, here's the first confinement, and we see everything's going down. And here's the second confinement. We don't have a reduction in traffic because the second confinement was not the same, the second quarantine, excuse me. Schools were somewhat open, some activities were permitted. So what I'd like to flag here is that the city was at total stop, but despite that, we still had a 50% measurement of activity level. So Paris was able to, if everyone were to stop going to work tomorrow, the emissions would actually only go down by half. So this shows us the enormous challenge that's in front of us for 2030 and beyond. We all can see the various mobility restrictions. Here you see actual Paris, the Parisian region, and then the greater Parisian region. Paris has about 3 million people, whereas the greater Parisian area has 12 million inhabitants. Let's look at Cape Town now in South Africa. It's a very interesting scenario. It's a coastal city with a big port and urban sprawl that is quite large, going 2 to 3% per year. So we see that Cape Town put together its own measuring protocol. South Africa is very important, is a very main player. It has a high emissions level, but low growth. And we did the tracking and for the same way. And we can see that the seasonal cycles reversed as to in Europe in the Northern Hemisphere. But in winter, you cannot say quite simply that as the temperatures go down, the emissions will go up. You have to see what are the actual human activities, what season, and how they're actually doing this following the season. So now let's look at Jakarta, which is a totally different scenario. It's a tropical city. So here there's not much of a seasonal variety, but we have a rainy and a dry season. Yeah, I can show you Jakarta. Behind Jakarta, they have very high mountains, 3,000-meter elevation. So it's a very large difference between Jakarta and the mountains. Here you can see the difference in the CO2 emissions. You see the rainy and the dry season. They have a large change in activities and behavior because what people are doing during the dry season and the rainy season is totally different. But you can see here that there's a lot of floods. So during the flood period, traffic is very difficult. So it's slowed down. Traffic comes to a halt. The traffic goes down here during these periods. And we see that also the CO2 goes down. So, and how do they measure this? Satellites. It's really the solution for the rest of the world. So how do we use satellites? How do they measure it? They measure how much sun is being reflected into the atmosphere and then reflected out.
You can see here the satellite on the city of Lahore in Pakistan. Here the satellite has measured a pollution cloud. It's just like a pollution cloud, but it's actually CO2. There's actually aerosols in the city. There's clouds. It's complicated, but we managed to get data like that, and we can measure pollution in the CO2 emissions of the city. Here's another thing for the Washington. This is a new satellite that does multiple passes, allows us to have maps. Here we have different passovers, flyovers, with a very important topography, and that shows here the CO2 anomaly which we're measuring. So these are the emissions that are measured by the satellite, and that creates basically a cloud of CO2. So we can also measure cities that do not have ground-based CO2 towers in order to see if both figures fit. There's another thing which is really important, two very important aspects here, is the trust. Right now, there is a lack of trust. The figures done by the cities, we know there's problems. We know we can't exactly trust the figures that are good. When the public policy is implemented, we have a hope, and then we need to verify. Very often, political measures, there's not much monitoring. We know there's been an impact on circulation, but we don't know what the covariation are. If people abandon their car to take the bus, then it's good, but if they stop walking to get to buses, you haven't won anything. So it's not really always possible to have the real impact of policies. And since it's very quickly, we're talking about 2030, so we have 10 years left. If we need to wait for 4 years to find out what we've done in 2020, so if you're on the wrong trend, you have only 5 years left in order to catch up with what you've done wrongly. So we need a much faster monitoring, and we need to know if in 2 or 3 years the policies are going to work, else the policy is going to take on the wrong trend, and you're not going to be able to catch up. So this is the interest I see in this system, in the importance of having quick data available that is not necessarily quickly available for political deciders. Thank you, Thomas. So thank you for this very quick and very clear presentation. I mean, here we are on a very concrete level of details on the different cities. It would be interesting maybe to potentially develop these techniques on major African cities, growing African cities. So do not hesitate today in the audience if you would be interested in West Africa that has a strong growth of its economic activities and urbanization, it could be interesting for you to contact Thomas to work on this. Thank you, Thomas. We're going to continue now on the emission and the compiling of data in order to help us to prepare public policies for tomorrow for climate mitigation. Thomas, you mentioned in the flooding in Jakarta and the impacts on urban mobility. I think that Ture, who is with us, he's the president and founder of Geomatica, which is a company which you're managing today. You are also at the Senegal Ibrahima University. You're working on geomatics. Geomatics is not something that we all know well. Particularly, how can this be used in order to better anticipate the growth of future cities or the different climate phenomena that can influence everyday life. Thank you for this presentation. So I'm the founder of Geomatica. I'm also a researcher and teacher at the university and today I'm speaking to you more on the Geomatica dimension. To simplify, geomatics is a set of trends where when you do GPS localization, you do geomatic. It's basically you use data from the space, geolocalized from space, and the cartography of cities. When you do image analysis, all this is geomatics. And of course, let's not forget topographics. So it's a number of skills that have as a aim to analyze and exploit the space collected information. You have the geographical information system, T-detection, you have the weather trends analysis, all this. So all this is geomatics. Based on what we're talking about today, I wanted to present what we are doing thanks to the data provided by the information, by the satellite networks. We base ourselves on very simple paradigm. Climate change is not something that has been made up. The population, the city, they feel its impacts every day. As a researcher, I've been able to collect information, and when I've seen the changes in our territories, urban territories and rural, and we need to analyze and evaluate how far our research work can be transformed into action, can be actionized by local populations so that they can understand the changes that they live in and understand also what actions they need to undertake in order to face or to mitigate these changes. So we have done lots of research and development activities and also working together with young people and children, school children, in order to raise awareness on climate change's impact in our territories. I'm going to very quickly through the application. We do lots of research and development on environment, climate and territorial development topics. We also speaking, the climate today has an impact on our territories. It affects the populations and the different conditions, economical conditions, the sea, the land, the environment. How do our populations deal with this, and what we as scientific actors can do to help them to face these changes? So this we do here we have land use mappings over time. We do a timeline in order to see what the changes are in land use here between 1972 and 2018, for instance. You see here what are the changes. This was a land, agricultural land that was not, what was flooded and what is not, what was irrigated was not. Well, so what happened in the change of land use? So we have satellite data which we're going to analyze in order to make economical maps and geomatic maps. So here you can see on these various maps here what is the evolution, the spatial of the space of the surface of each occupation pattern, land use pattern. We have the We have the water class, the undeveloped land, forest cover, and habitat category. And we try to see how it has increased or decreased over a period of time. And we try to see what are the factors that have driven these changes and what are the consequences of these changes on the environment and on mankind. So this is what we're doing. A quick overview, tools for the, we also have drones, we have surveys. So it's easy to see that how the climate change really impacts. So we try to really illustrate this dynamic. People say that the flooding is, the sea is eating away, but we need to know how fast and how much land has been lost to rising sea floors. So all these are elements that we've done in various areas of Senegal. Forestry, see how these areas evolve, what are the usage changes in land use, etc. We have also, can we also do concrete actions? We do a mapathon, a geomapathon for 48 hours. We put people together and we're going to observe the environment with them, with local stakeholders. What are the changes, climatic, economic, and what actions do we propose in 4 protected areas? What are the climate changes? What are the impacts? What are the causes? What are the consequences? So that the young people who are the leaders of tomorrow, they can be aware of the changes that are required in the future. So in order for the strategies that will be highlighted in these strategies, because we need to prepare for these climate changes, and it's a new future generation that will have to, we see young people for which we work. We have card games around climate change. We do conferences, we do role games, and also what we're doing, and we also do reforestation initiative. Dr. Tori, can you maybe talk a less fast so the interpreters can follow? We try through the Geo 448 hours Mapathon to mobilize and to raise awareness on the climate impacts, to show the young people what the causes are, what the factors are, what the impacts are, and what we need to do as young people to go against that. And this has, we have worked with about 500 young people in Senegal, and that today are aware of these issues, but we go beyond. We do actions, we do reforestation, we distribute seed packets. We try to get people to abandon plastic bags and things like that. So really the environmental aspect. So through awareness raising, also do concrete actions with people in the field and young people in the field. This is Geo 48 hours Mapathon. We've also done what we did, one class, one map. This is a very simple concept. We say that children in the primary school, they are our main target, because it's the children of today that will be the deciders of tomorrow. And it's important that through our space methodology, be it drones, satellites, or the different surveys, we can show them how these tools can lead us to understand the changes in climate and the impact of climate change. So we do lots of workshops with children in the schools, in primary schools and intermediate schools, in order to raise awareness on the actions that need to be carried out in terms of climate, the factors of the climate. In this, they understand this, and for us, it's important to prepare the future generation on this. So we have called this program Geo Kids 2021, and it's really targeting young people. And here again, we do various initiatives around climate change with comic books, local examples taken in the territories, in local languages, If we go in Casamance, we speak with Mandingo. If we in the north, we are going to speak in Pearl. So really important is to get children to understand climate change, its effects, and speak their language. And we can see that the children understand very quickly and will organize their own initiatives to say, okay, now I need to be aware of this, because this action in my village can have an impact on the global climate. For us, it is extremely important. This goes so beyond simple data collection. What actions can provoke and what can we instill with the young people? There's also another initiative regarding flooding, Inondation 221, together with a community of actors in order to be able to map the flooded area or the regions that are subject to inundations in Senegal. We have an Android app where we have been able to map the vulnerability sectors for a number of cities in Senegal. We try to see in these areas what are the areas that are most exposed to flooding. And it's not just rain floods. It's also we also tame the topography. We look at which are the low level areas and the under the water level areas. If there's problems from the sea or from the rivers, if they overflow, what are the areas that are potentially impacted or at risk of this climate phenomenon which we are all facing. And so here again we have a population. We use these maps in their local language. They know in their areas, in their cities, in the areas, which are the areas that are at risk of flooding. So this is Inondation 221. We have an entire community around this issue in Senegal, and we have different countries also, Chad, Niger, Mali, Ivory Coast, where we're going to develop the same application with other countries. So this is a success story that works really well. And so I just wanted to show you a quick video. Maybe you can put the YouTube link if you want to see a video about these different activities that we have carried out, and that summarize our activities quite well. In summary, we're trying to have a bottom-up inverse. How can the scientific results be proofs that we can to local populations so that they can act against or to mitigate climate change? And for us, we want to activate that information, because there's been lots of talk. Now we need to act on the front lines, because people, they see these impacts of climate change, they live the climate effects, but very often they're passive, and very often they don't understand because they do not speak the scientific language, and they don't understand these scientific results. For them, it's too complex. So we need to translate in everyday language, in their native language, so the people who are directly impacted by these phenomena can really act against. And that's why in Geomatica, we're trying to find all the development solutions so that research, the data compiled and established by research, by scientific research, can be activated at grassroots level. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Touré. Do not hesitate to send us the link in the chat of the of this video, and thank you about presenting Geomatica. Also, the link to Geomatica for anyone who wants to join your project. You insisted on the creation of a common language that would allow everyone here to understand the climate risks to which we are exposed, and to understand the data that we've managed to collect via geomatics, via monitoring system, atmospheric monitoring system that Thomas presented us, or the activity data that will allow us to create carbon database that Joe has presented to us. So there is a training challenge here. Thibault Laconde, you are an engineer and you've been working with climate change for a long time. Today, you are the manager of Calendar, which a startup which you created 2 years ago. And if we look at this analysis, this challenge of analysis of the risks is something that you're trying to solve this challenge with Calendar and the databases that you're offering, and you have developed a project evaluation project in a project in Burkina Faso. Thibault, it's your turn. Okay, I'm aligning basically what Toure was just said before. The question we are asking ourselves if we're trying to predict the events before they happen. There are evolutions, climate evolutions undergoing, and we can see that events that we can predict, for instance, the heat wave that we had in Algeria and Morocco recently, or in Canada, the heat dome, where we had the droughts in Alaska, where so if we cannot predict these events, then we will be impacted even worse by them. So it's important that we'll be able to predict these events and so that we can prepare and mitigate. This is not science fiction. It's not a crystal ball. There's a very important scientific research that has been carried out on this in the past years that allow us today to have tools, methodologies at local stage. So now that we have these tools, how can we provide these data sets to the people who need them and to the deciders who will have to take the decisions, companies, public authorities, but also private persons. If you have a house, you need to know if there's going to be a bushfire or how you need to isolate it or things like this. Or is your house adapted to the heat waves that are coming, things like that. So how can you distribute these local climate data? The first question you need to ask yourself, what is climate data? There's numerous levels. It can be raw data that just come out of the that has been measured, but it's not very easy because it's fairly complex to use. There's lots of, usually it's huge files with not very user-intuitive formats. Sometimes you can't even open them on your computer. The second set of data is climate data, which is basically a first valorization of the previous data with mappings, with graphs, visualization of data, just so you could see how the temperatures evolve or the rainfalls over a regional local stage.
The third level is the impact evaluation, impact assessment. Here you can see the French map. We look at the various models, and then we look at what these models say, and we see how the rain levels are, and then we see if, for example, there is a risk of floods, and what is the impact of climate change on the specific area. So what is climate data, and who are the people who are using it? Only scientists? No, it's not the case. Sometimes local authorities, companies, everyone is using this data. And also the question of access depends upon who is actually looking at the data. In Africa, they have raw data with related issues that are quite different to what we have here in France, for example. We see that some weather stations in Africa are quite old, but and they're still using, for example, paper to put together the data. So there is a different way to exploit, to capture, and to aggregate the data, depending on the country where you may be. And in some countries, data is quite simply not available. Also, there's the problem of observation gaps in Africa. And there's for example, we've had observations or observatories that have been working for a century, and they no longer exist, and they no longer work. This is the case, for example, in Mali. So this leads us to the fact that the data is not as long-term as it should be, and it's difficult. The access to the actual raw data is quite difficult in other countries. So we need this raw data to be able to put together and calibrate the model. This is something that's quite specific to the African continent. So how about the assessment? There are some continent-specific issues, and there are also just regular general issues that we have to look at. This is the impact assessment is local, of course. It's of high need. And we can also see that the impact of weather can be quite different in a very small area. You move 100 meters and the impact can be different. So that's why we need to have these impact assessments. There's also there's an issue in the availability of technical capacities in the various countries. Sometimes the way of calculating the raw data is also not up to date. So there's a problem with the assessment, the impact assessment, and also the availability of technical capacities. And there's also a problem with access to calculation methods. So what is the solution? These are climate services. What is it? It's something that transforms scientific data into exploitable information that is then used by a large amount of users, governments, companies, or could be citizens also. So we need many stages to put this into place. We need raw data concerning the weather, geography, floodplains, soil characteristics. So you have to have access to this data, and then you have to really look at it. And then you have to put together the impact models. So, for example, you have to see how there's an impact of this data on the local economy, agriculture, or what have you. After you have the actual data itself, then you have to put it together, and you have to put it in an exploitable format. It can be a graph, a table, and everything has to be adapted to the actual end user. So all of this takes quite a lot of time, and it needs a certain amount of expertise, but it's very necessary. We know that data is petroleum of the 21st century. Sometimes it's very it has a very high worth, but we can't really capture it. And this is one of the problems with access to the data. So by using the data that exists today, we have to put in place the infrastructure for putting together these impact assessments and then putting it in a format that can be used by the end user. And we also have to give access to the largest amount of people possible. So we have to know what are the climatic risks that we're exposed to. And we have to make sure that the end user is not only big companies or governments, it has to be everyone. So the solution is not obvious. The structure that we're trying to put in place is to really reduce costs to be able to have the largest amount of end users possible. So the challenge is very large, and we solve this challenge by creating the largest accessibility possible so that everyone can really have a look at what the climate risk is. You can find more information on the website that has just been put up. Thank you very much for the challenges that you have spoken about, and also the idea that you have to really use AI to analyze and treat the data. We know that even large institutions do not have these AI solutions. The proposal that you have set forth is based upon processing data by using AI and using various programs. You also said that data is the petroleum of the 21st century. You say it's easy to extract, but it's more difficult to process. So what are the services that you're offering? And explaining in the most simple way possible what they are. We do not put together studies, we actually develop tools. So there you've got a problem. You're going to put together a hydroelectric project, and you have to know how much water is going to be in your dam. Not only today, but in 40 or 50 years, because the dams will still be there. So you need to do research on the climate. You have to compile data. All of this is quite a daunting task. So what we try to do is we try to reproduce this work and use this tool for each new project. So we try to develop as many wide range tools as possible. This will allow people to find the climate models, to find the various risks in their areas. We know that from the onset, it may take a bit more time because the model has to be put together. But then on the second stage, when it's actually being put in place and used, the analysis will be much quicker and easier because the tool will have been put together, and we will make it available to the person who needs, or the group that needs the data. And then they will be able not only to extract the data, but also process it. This will allow the person to, for example, quite simply type in their address and find the main climate risks at the place where you are. So I think it's a very good future possibility. And I hope that everybody follows you on social media. And of course, you can share your address in the sidebar chat. And we want to amplify the amount of projects to the greatest number possible. Of course, this is the goal of this meeting, and we really want to involve everyone, including on-the-ground workers that working with NGOs. And I think there may be people who may be able to help you in your project, especially concerning access to climate data. But not only on this, but on many other topics also. So can we take 5 minutes to look at Q&A? So there's someone who wanted to make a comment about Joyatu's presentation, at least I think so. Would you like to make a comment as to her presentation? So please turn on your microphone. Good afternoon. I'm from Ivory Coast, Mr. Emi Indre. So within my projects, one of our activities concerns emission factors and the development of them. We don't know how to put in place and how to do this research project concerning emission factors. And I would like to make a comment to Madame Weg's presentation. Maybe she can help us. So what I'd like to know, how can we really move forward with this? So firstly, please download the note or the report. We have a consortium training here there. I don't know if you're working on infrastructures. I don't know if you have experts. I don't know if you already have a tool. So please download the report, the note, and map the stakeholders. It's something that you can print out and then fill out and see if you have all of the skill sets necessary. And then following this, if you follow the report or the note, you will be able then to contact us and see what you need in specific terms. So have a look in the chat. I think it has been, the link has been shared. It's in the links given by ABC, Association Bilan Carbone. You can find it in the chat. So this allows you to inform yourselves, of course, but also to have the necessary contacts if you want to keep moving forward with the organization. Yes, I already have the note, the report. But I just wanted to see what are the steps that I need to take. So thank you very much for answering to allow us to work, to move forward on this project. Thank you. Thank you very much for this question. It was a very practical question, and I hope you will be able to move forward with your project. We spoke about the training sessions. We spoke with the various organizations. They've already put their links on the sidebar chat. You can have a look on the internet. What is the difference between this project and the MMV? Oh, MRV. Measure, reduce, verify.
Vuriatou, est-ce que tu veux répondre à ça?
So would Madame Wag like to respond to this? I don't really know exactly what the MRV is, and it's an independent tool, and probably accounting will be able to give data to the report, and this will allow local authorities to evaluate their own carbon footprint, and then to also put together their own carbon base. So you're able to use the emissions factors to put together your own carbon base.
Votre empreinte au Cameroun, que vous allez vous dire youpi, elle a baissé, mais en fait elle n'a pas vraiment baissé parce que c'est dû à une technologie qui a été développée ailleurs et qui ne
reflète pas. You can see that there will be gaps as to what is used as technological advances. In France, they may have a new data piece, whereas in Africa, for example, this data will not be available, or this. So there are gaps between the different countries. There's also regulatory gaps. There are various changes in laws, especially here in Europe, that have gone into how you can use different tools and different techniques for measuring. And I think this is a best practice for policy makers concerning greenhouse gas emissions and also the carbon footprint. So last question. It was written. So we looked at the geomatic presentation by Mr. Touré. Does geomatic allow us to see the impact of climate change on water drilling in the future? And if yes, then what methodology are you using? It's Mr. Tchernoussin who asked this question.
Il faudrait lever la main peut-être avec l'outil Zoom, mais sinon on peut vous trouver parmi les participants. Oui, vous avez levé la main.
Bon. Please raise your hand. Please turn on your microphone. Turn on your microphone, please. Thank you.
Oui, bonjour,
Can you hear me? Yes.
Bonjour, est-ce que vous m'entendez?
On vous entend bien, oui.
Bonjour, bon, je me présente, c'est Tchernoussin.
afternoon. My name is Janosa. I am involved in climate change. I'd like to thank Dr. Toure for his presentation. So my question is, can Geomatica have an impact and evaluate the impact of climate change on welling, on drilling, excuse me? And if yes, then what were the tools that were used to do so?
Monsieur Touré, est-ce que vous voulez répondre rapidement à cette question dans les quelques
Mr.
minutes?
Touré, would you like to answer?
J'ai travaillé pour le compte de la laiterie du Berger dans la zone nord.
I worked in the north of the country concerning drilling.
La cartographie des cultures fourragères, mais on
So
l'a
we were
fait
able to put together some mapping concerning this. And we were using the GPS to see who was drilling and where. And this is something that we did in Senegal. If you send me your email, you will be able to, I will send you the report with the various steps that we actually followed. We also had a project Dolima in Senegal. And I think we've been doing this for 6 years now. Please send me your email and I will be able to send you our findings following the work in the north of the country concerning drilling. Thank you.
Merci à vous deux pour cet échange très concret.
Thank you very much for this very hands-on exchange. And it allows us to see what Mr. Toure has done in practical terms. We think that there are some practitioners who are watching us. If you want to share with us what your projects are, of course, use the chat and the sidebar chat and send us your email addresses so that we can really share information concerning your projects. So Thibault already spoke about an issue. Why is it fundamental to have access to data for climate change? It's something that we think is quite simply an accepted truth, but why is data access so important? Why is transparency so important? And can you give us a few words as to this topic? Maybe Thibault can answer this topic question that I just asked. It concerns adaptation, essentially. We see that we are confronted with new phenomena. For example, the 50 degrees that was attained, that was measured in Canada this summer. If we're not able to adapt, all of the infrastructure, all the equipment that we have is not going to be able to be used because it has to adapt to these new realities. And we have to look at this over a very long term. So we have, if you want to adapt, you have to have access to the data. You cannot use historical data which are no longer current. Or it's going to be cost prohibitive to really go forward with very long-term data. So we have to have access to this data to actually know what we're basing our forecasts on and what our projects will be made up of. And so it's necessary to have access to, when we talk about greenhouse gases, climate change, we have to be able to anticipate what will happen and to also adapt to what will happen. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists and all of the participants. I invite you to join us for the closing ceremony this afternoon. And we also have a workshop concerning access to energy and efficiency. And we also are going to talk about the big green wall and the biodiversity corridors in Africa. Thank you very much.
Merci, au revoir.